So you got yourself a Canon R8, but you're not entirely sure how to set it up. In this video, I'll guide you through the menus to help you configure your camera settings for both photography and video. I'll also teach you how to customize buttons, dials, and quick controls. And finally, I'll show you how to capture all of your most used settings in custom shooting modes, so that you can use your R8 like a pro with just a flick of a switch. Right, so this video might be a long one. My goal is to guide you through the process step by step, and I guarantee that by the end of the video, you'll be able to fully customize your R8 and take your photo and video game to the next level. And don't hesitate to hit me up in the comments if you have any questions. Okay, let's begin with general settings in the menu. These will apply to all modes on the camera and to both the photo and video environments. Set the camera to manual mode using the mode dial. Alternatively, if you know you'll be using one of the priority modes more often, set it to that mode instead. Now press the menu button. You can use the dials to navigate through the menus or simply use the D-pad on the back, which is even easier. Pro tip, pressing the info button will allow you to browse through the menu sections quickly. The general settings are in the yellow section with the wrench icon. Select folder allows you to choose the folder on the SD card where you want to save your photos and videos. You can also create new folders if you want. I recommend leaving file numbering set to continuous, which will automatically increase the numbers in the file names of your photos and videos. You can also reset it if necessary. You have the option to format the SD card in the camera, but please note that this will erase all data on the card. The auto rotate options will automatically rotate your photos if they are shot vertically. There are three available options. The first option will rotate the images on the camera screen, viewfinder, and on the images transferred to your computer. The second option will only rotate images transferred to the computer, displaying vertical images in a vertical aspect ratio on the camera screen. Useful if you often shoot vertical content. Finally, you can turn off rotation completely and manually adjust everything in post. I'll keep it on the first option. Add video rotate info will automatically rotate vertical videos when transferring them to your computer. It's a convenient feature, so let's enable it. If needed, you can also change the date, time, and language in this tab. Now let's move to the second tab. Under Video System, you can choose either PAL or NTSC, depending on your location. NTSC is used in North America, Japan, and most of South America, while PAL is used in Europe, most of Asia, Africa, and parts of South America. I'm in Europe, so I will set this to PAL. The help text size can remain small, unless you prefer bigger things. Now let's talk about Mode Guide. When enabled, the camera will display a brief description of the selected shooting mode every time you change the mode dial. Now this can be helpful for beginners, but it becomes annoying quickly, so I will turn this off. Feature Guide is similar to Mode Guide, but it provides a brief description of the selected setting in the quick menu. Again, this can be useful for familiarizing yourself with the camera's features, but if you already know these things, turn it off. Enabling beep will cause the camera to emit a beep sound once it achieves focus. Alternatively, you can customize volumes for different actions on the camera, which gives you more control. There are also settings for headphone input available here. Moving on to tab 3, we have power saving. Personally, I don't like the screens or camera turning off by themselves. When I know I won't be using the camera for a while, I just turn it off manually. So I will turn off all of these options. The other options are related to the screen and viewfinder settings. I will leave them as they are. On tab 4, you can adjust the sensitivity of the touchscreen. Choose which buttons are deactivated when the lock switch is on and initiate sensor cleaning. The default settings are fine here. Additionally, you can configure the camera's USB port output for file transfer, remote control, webcam, streaming, or mobile apps. This is a setting that you might frequently use, and I'll show you how to add it to a custom menu later in the video. Finally, on tab 5, you can reset various settings of the camera. This is useful when you want to start over or erase your settings settings for someone else to use the camera. This is also where you can set custom shooting modes, which correspond to the C1 and C2 buttons on the mode dial. I will guide you through this step by step later in the video, after we've configured everything else. You can also access battery information here, as well as display, edit and delete copyright information. I recommend adding copyright information, as it will be embedded in all of the photos and videos that you shoot with this camera. Lastly, you will find a link to the manual and software web pages, certification logos and firmware versions for both the camera and the attached lens. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, please smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Okay, now that we have covered the general settings, let's quickly go over the playback settings, which are in the blue section with the play icon. The first tab provides a couple settings to edit images, videos and folders that are stored on the SD card. The second tab contains options for processing raw images on the SD card. Now personally, I don't use any of these features from the first two tabs, as I prefer to do these edits in post-production. However, feel free to configure these settings to suit your needs. On the third tab, you can find options for conversion, setting up a slideshow and configuring search conditions. These are features that I personally don't use in camera. However, the last three options are worth mentioning. View from last scene will display the last viewed image when you press the playback button on the back of the camera. Disabling this option will start the playback from the most recent shot whenever the camera is restarted. I'll leave this enabled. With the magnification settings, you can configure the amount of magnification that takes place when pressing the zoom button in playback mode. You can also choose to which point in the frame the magnification will zoom into. I prefer leaving it on the focus point, as it helps me to quickly determine if my subject is sharp and in focus. Leave maintain position disabled. In playback mode, you can assign a function to the top dial. I prefer jump to first image of scene, as it makes it easy to look through photos if you shoot in bursts a lot. Lastly, on tab 4, you can select the information displays to show additional information about an image or video when pressing the info button in playback mode. Highlight alerts can be helpful for monitoring highlights. When you enable this option, blinking alerts will be displayed on the screen when your photo or video has clipped highlights. We will add a shortcut to this option later, so we can easily toggle it on or off. AF point display can show the autofocus area that was used while capturing the image. Note that this is not added to your image saved to your SD card, it's only shown on the camera screen and viewfinder during playback. I'll leave this setting off, as I always use the magnification setting, which we just configured to zoom in to the focus point. But the option is here if you want it. The remaining options here are fine as is. Right, now let's take a quick look at the communication settings. These are quite straightforward. Navigate to the purple section with a dual arrow icon. On the first tab, we have a couple presets to set up a wireless connection to mobile devices, remotes, and the Canon software on a computer. Once the connection is set up, you'll be able to browse images on the camera from your device, and even control the camera remotely. I'm actually using this feature right now with my Mac to record this video. Further on this tab, you can also configure settings to send images to the cloud and access advanced connection options. On the second tab, there are additional connection settings, such as airplane mode, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. You can also change the camera's name here, making it easier to find when you're connecting things. Additionally, you can set up a GPS device, such as a receiver or your smartphone. Configuring all of these settings is pretty easy. Just follow the on-screen instructions. If you encounter any problems or have any questions, let me know in the comments. Alright, with all of that configured, let's focus on camera settings for photography. Now before we proceed, double check that the switch located on the top left is set to the photo environment. And let's make sure that we're still in the manual mode. Now open the menu and go to the red section with the camera icon. First up, image quality. Here you can choose the image formats in which you want to save your photos. Now this is subjective and different people have different preferences. Personally, I prefer shooting in RAW format because it allows adjusting exposure settings in post-production, like in Lightroom. Now, CRAW is a compressed RAW format and has the advantage that the files are about half the size of RAW files, with little to no decrease in quality. So that's what I use 99% of the time. You also have the option to save additional JPEG or HEIF files. While these formats may not offer much flexibility in post-processing, they are ready to be shared immediately. Now, I don't really use them, but it's up to you. I will leave dual pixel RAW disabled and aspect ratio set to full frame. Again, I can make all of these adjustments much more efficiently during post-production. On tab 2, leave everything as is. There are options for exposure compensation and ISO, but you can easily adjust these using the R8 dials and buttons. We'll set that up later in the video. There are also options for HDR and lighting, but honestly, you will need them unless you have a very specific use case. So let's keep moving. On tab 3, we have anti-flickering settings. These are particularly useful in environments with a lot of artificial lighting, such as Christmas lights. The camera can detect the rate at which the lights flicker and adjust the shutter speed accordingly, preventing banding in the images caused by the flickering lights. Another useful setting for in our quick menu later in the video. You can also set controls for external speed lights and adjust the metering mode, which is the method used to measure a subject's brightness. I always leave this on the default, evaluative. Moving on to tab 4, white balance. Now for photography, I leave this set to auto white balance, unless I'm shooting in a space with controlled lighting or a specific color temperature. Adjusting white balance in post-production is easy anyway. It's quite a bit different for video, but I'll explain that in the video section. You can also set a custom white balance by taking a picture of a white object and using it as a reference. The next options are fine with their default settings, which brings us to picture style. I personally prefer using the neutral style as it is most flexible for post-production. Clarity can stay at 0 and creative filters off. Plenty of options to be creative in post. On to tab 5, I always enable all corrections under lens aberration. Why not, right? Keep long exposure noise reduction off and high ISO speed noise reduction on the default standard. There's also an option for dust delete data, but I have honestly never used it on any of my cameras. Maybe I'm just super clean. Next, multiple exposure on tab 6. I leave that off because again, post-production. However, it's here if you want to overlay multiple exposures in camera. Next, there's raw burst mode. I personally don't use this feature a lot, but if you're into wildlife, bird or sports photography where subjects are constantly moving around quickly, you'll definitely want to use this feature. It allows you to take super fast continuous shots in RAW and extract a specific image from them later. You also have pre-shooting available here, which can capture images even before you fully press the shutter, so you won't miss any shots. This brings us to focus bracketing. With this feature turned on, the camera will capture multiple shots, gradually increasing the focus distance each time. The shots are then combined into one image with everything sharp in focus, even when using wide apertures. This technique is often used for landscape or in macro photography, where it can be challenging to get everything in focus at a short distance. For now though, I'll leave these settings on this tab disabled, and I'll add shortcuts for easy access later in the video. On tab 7, you can select the drive mode. By default, I'll set this to high speed continuous. This means that when you press and hold the shutter button, the camera will take several successive photos in a burst. This increases your chances of capturing that one awesome shot. You can also set the self timer here if you want to be in the photo yourself. We'll add all of this to the quick menu later for easy access too. You can use the interval timer to have the camera take a photo every X seconds until the total number of shots is reached. This can be useful in certain situations. The bulb timer allows you to set shutter speeds longer than 30 seconds, but it only works if the mode dial is set to bulb mode. It's handy for capturing extreme low light scenes like night skies or fireworks. I'll leave it disabled. Silent shutter can remain off, as we have already adjusted the volume settings in the general settings. Now the R8 does not have a mechanical shutter, so I'll leave it to electronic first curtain. Later in the video we'll set up a custom mode to easily switch to the full electronic shutter for fast-paced action shots. Last, let's turn off release shutter without card to avoid taking photos, only to then realize there's no SD card in the camera. Now on to tab 8, Image Stabilizer. The R8 does not have IBIS, so options here are limited. For now, I will leave it off. Next, we can customize quick controls, but we will cover that in a dedicated section later in the video. Set touch shutter to disabled, so you don't accidentally take pictures with your nose pressed against the screen. With image review, the camera will display every photo you take on the screen for a certain amount of time. Personally, I don't like this feature, as it messes up my flow. If I want to review my photos, I'll just press the playback button. The other options on this tab are fine, so let's move on. On tab 9, we have display simulation. I always set this to exposure and depth of field, in order to get a real-time representation on the screen and viewfinder of how the final image will look like in terms of brightness and depth of field. Without depth of field preview, you won't be able to see how adjusting the aperture changes the depth of field and the background blur or bokeh. OVF View Assist can stay off, as this is a feature from the old DSLR days. Under Shooting Info Display and then Screen Info Settings, you can select which information is shown on the screen when you press the Info button during a shoot. I typically use 3 options that I toggle between: a minimal one with full info, histogram and levels, and a clean one. But set it up as you prefer. Note that you can toggle certain details on and off by pressing Info again. In the next option, you can customize the same information for the viewfinder as well. Moving on, I like to have a grid on the screen, as it helps me compose my shots more accurately. I'll use 3x3 plus diagonals. For the histogram, I'll leave it set to brightness and the size small. The large histogram just takes up too much real estate on the screen. Under lens display options, I keep the focus distance display in manual focus mode only, so whenever I switch to manual focus, the distance meter will pop up. I use meter for units, but change to feet if that works better for you. I really like the focal length display option enabled. It shows the current focal length on the screen, which is really useful when using zoom lenses. The rest of the settings looks good here. Finally, in tab 10, change the movie recording size to 4K 25p. That's 24p or 30p if you're in an NTSC region. Now just to clarify, this setting is only applicable if you press the record button while you're still in the photo environment, without switching the top switch to video. Now set the sound recording to manual and decrease the recording level. This is to prevent audio clipping. Additionally, disable the wind filter and the noise reduction. These features are not very good and can be easily adjusted during post-production. The rest of the settings in tab 10 are fine, so we're done here. Which brings us to video settings. Now most of the settings will be inherited from the photo settings, but there are a couple specific video only settings in the menu. First, put the top left switch to the video environment. Then open the menu and navigate to the red section with the camera icon. Let's set the movie recording size to 4K 25p IPB as the default. If you're in the US, it will be 24p, and if you prefer 30p, set that. The high frame rate option will unlock recording in 100 frames per second in PAL regions or 120 frames per second in the NTSC regions. For now, I'll leave this off. We'll add shortcuts to all of these settings later. Now, movie cropping. The R8 is a full frame camera with a 6K sensor. We can apply a 1.6 movie crop, resulting in a 4K APS-C sensor equivalent. This can be useful for a couple of reasons. You may want to use an APS-C lens that you already have, or have more reach or zoom with your full frame lens, like for filming wildlife. For example, with movie crop enabled, a 300mm full-frame lens would provide a similar reach to a 480mm lens. Now I've dedicated an entire video to sensor sizes and crops, so if you want to learn more about that, I'll link it down below. For now, let's leave this setting off. Our sound recording options have been carried over from the photography settings, so we can leave them as they are. Tab 2 has the same options as in the photo settings, and on tab 3 everything looks good as well. Which brings us to white balance on tab 4. As I mentioned earlier, this is where photography and video are different. In photography, you capture a still frame, and shooting in RAW format allows you to adjust exposure settings during post-production. On the other hand, video captures moving frames, and the lighting conditions may change throughout the shot. If you leave the white balance on auto while shooting video, the camera will constantly try to adjust it, making it very difficult to adjust in post. That's why it's better to use a fixed white balance when shooting video. In essence, you need to adjust the white balance to match the lighting conditions of the environment you are in. The camera offers several presets to make that easier, such as daylight, shade, cloudy, etc. You can also set a custom white balance or use a custom Kelvin value. When shooting outdoors, it's convenient to use one of the presets. When shooting in a studio with controlled lighting, however, it might be better to use a custom Kelvin value that matches the temperature of the lights, or set a custom white balance. To start, let's set the white balance to daylight, just to have a default fixed value. So even if you forget to change it for your shoot, you'll still be able to somewhat tweak it during post-production. The next couple of settings are inherited from the photo settings, bringing us to Canon log settings. Without going into much detail, log is a flat color profile that allows your camera to record as much dynamic range as possible. Basically, it offers much more flexibility to color grade in post-production. Let me know down in the comments if you'd like me to make a dedicated video about it. Personally, I shoot with log enabled 99% of the time. And here are my settings. Canon log on, C-Log 3. View assist on. This will give a more saturated preview on the screen, but it does not affect the footage saved to your SD card. That will still be in the flat log profile. Characteristics are okay, and for color space I always use Cinema Gamut. Moving to tab 5, once again, I will enable all of the corrections and leave the noise reduction set to standard. On tab 6, everything looks fine. I don't use pre-recording or the self-timer. However, there is one interesting setting here, time-lapse. It's currently disabled because you can't record a time-lapse with Canon log enabled. If you turn off log, you can enable time-lapse and customize options such as the interval, number of shots, quality, exposure, etc. For now, I'll leave time-lapse disabled. We'll set up a shortcut for this later. Now let's go to tab 7. As I mentioned before, the R8 does not have IBIS. When it comes to image stabilization for video, I adjust this setting depending on the lens I'm using. If the lens has built-in image stabilization, I usually leave stabilization off in camera. If the lens does not have IS, I turn on the digital stabilization in the camera. It actually works pretty well. We'll set up quick controls later in a dedicated section of the video. Next, we have two options that can be very useful for setting the right exposure in a shot: false colors and zebras. False colors display a shot in a color-coded system with 6 colors, based on the brightness levels. Zebras display striped pattern on the areas of a shot that are at a specific brightness. Now in terms of zebra settings, there's a whole science to it. I won't go into depth, but I typically set this up for middle gray, so that I can use my gray card to expose my shot. To do this, set the zebra 1 level to 35%. Now by default, I'll leave the actual setting off. Lastly on this tab, we have the shooting info display, which actually inherits the photo settings. However, there are two additional settings for video. Recording emphasis displays a blinking red frame on the screen when the camera is recording. This is a clear and easy way to make sure you're actually recording, so I definitely recommend turning this on. The aspect marker allows you to set markers on the screen, making it easier to frame your shots if you'll be using a different aspect ratio in editing. Now I usually edit in 16:9, so I'll leave this off. Finally, on tab 8, the options are fine as they are. However, if you want to change change the behavior when connecting a monitor over HDMI or want to use timecodes in your videos, this is where you make those changes. If you're enjoying this video so far, please smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. Up next, autofocus settings. We'll need to configure these for the photo and video environment, so let's start with autofocus for photography. First, let's make sure the switch on the top left is set to the photo environment. Now press menu and navigate to the pink autofocus menu, tap 1. There are 3 options for autofocus operation, and depending on what you shoot most often, you might favor one over the other. One shot is for static subjects. When you half press the shutter button, the camera will focus only once. If you recompose the shot while keeping the shutter half pressed, the focus will not adapt and will remain the same as when you first half pressed the shutter button. If you want to change focus, you'll need to let go of the shutter button, aim at your subject and half press the shutter button again. Servo is for moving subjects. As long as you hold down the shutter button halfway, the camera will continuously focus on the subject. So you will always focus on the subject even if you recompose the shot while half pressing the shutter button. And finally, AI focus will automatically switch between the other 2 modes, depending on what's going on in the frame. I'll go with servo. Next up is the autofocus area selection. This kind of speaks for itself. It's the area on the frame where the autofocus will be limited to once it is engaged. There are a couple of presets here, and it really comes down to personal preference and the type of photography that you do. So I'd say experiment with these different settings and find out what works best for you. The ones I use most often are single point and whole area autofocus. I'll set it to single point by default. The next setting, whole area tracking servo autofocus, is really interesting. With this turned off, subjects are tracked only within the boundaries of the selected autofocus area. With the setting turned on, the selected autofocus area will switch to whole area autofocus, so it can track subjects across the entire frame. Note that this only works when servo mode is enabled. I like to have this setting on because it offers the best of both worlds. Next, we can select the type of subject we want to detect. Like on many modern cameras, you can set it to people, animals or vehicles. But the R8, just like the R6 Mark II, has an auto option too. This is extremely useful as you won't have to remember to change settings all the time when you're out and about shooting. The dedicated subject setting might be a tad more accurate for that specific subject, but I use auto 99% of the time and it's working great. You also have the option to turn it off completely, which can be useful for product shots or landscapes. I'll set it to auto for now. You also have options for eye detection here. I leave this on auto, but if you want, you can set it to prioritize the left or the right eye, which is great for portraits. Under switching tracked subjects, you can customize the sensitivity of subject tracking, or stickiness. In other words, here's where you set if you want the subject tracking to give priority to the initial subject tracked in the frame, or you want it to switch tracking to other subjects easily when they enter the frame. Again, it really depends on what and how you like to shoot. I'll leave it on the default for now. On tab 2, you can customize the tracking sensitivity and speed of the servo autofocus. There are a couple of specific case presets here, so select the one that best suits your shooting style. In general though, I leave this on auto. It works quite well. Moving to tab 3, you can set a priority for one-shot autofocus. Setting it to focus means that the shot will not be taken until focus is achieved. The camera will only capture the image when the subject is in focus. On the other hand, setting it to release priority prioritizes shutter release over focus. The most important aspect here is capturing the moment, regardless of whether the subject is in focus or not. I'll leave it set to focus. Next, keep preview autofocus disabled to prevent the camera from continually trying to focus, even without half pressing the shutter. In the next option, you can set the behavior of the lens when autofocusing on a subject is not possible. I'll leave this on the default setting, but if you experience a lot of focus hunting, try turning this option off. Lastly, autofocus assist beam firing. This is basically that orange light that appears when you focus. I prefer to be more low profile, so I'm turning this off. On tab 4, I will enable touch and drag autofocus settings. Since the R8 does not have a joystick, this will allow you to easily move around the focus area by dragging your thumb across the screen while looking through the viewfinder. The R8 also offers an alternate option that allows you to tap on the screen to switch between multiple detected subjects in the frame, but I personally find the touch and drag option to be more versatile. There are a couple more options for positioning and sensitivity below, but they are good as they are. In the next option, you have the ability to limit the autofocus areas. This means that you can hide the areas that you never use, making it quicker to select the ones that you need in the moment. I will disable a couple of areas here, but feel free to configure it according to your preference. The following options allow you to set the behavior of the autofocus position when switching orientation, as well as limit subject and eye detection options. For me, all of these settings are fine as they are. Now on tab 5, manual focus peaking settings. This adds a colored stroke on the screen to indicate what's in focus. It's particularly useful when using manual focus. By default, I would leave it off though, as it doesn't work well with zebras and false colors. I will also enable focus guide, which provides another indicator to assist with achieving accurate focus. Leave movie servo autofocus enabled. On tab 6, the first options are fine as they are. However, I prefer to change the RF lens focus ring sensitivity setting to rotation degree. This means that the amount of focus change is proportional to the degrees that the focus dial on the lens is rotated. With the default option, the focus changes more rapidly when the dial on the lens is rotated faster, and I find this much more difficult to use. Now let's also configure autofocus for video. Switch to the video environment by flicking the switch located on the top left corner and navigate to the pink autofocus menu, tab 1. I will keep movie servo autofocus enabled, which allows the camera to continuously focus to the selected area without the need to half press the shutter button. You can pause the servo function by pressing the button located in the lower left corner of the screen. Subject detection autofocus is an interesting setting. By default, with detection priority, movie servo autofocus will focus on anything within the focus area. If a subject is detected but leaves the frame or area, the camera will focus on what's behind, such as the background. With detection only, movie servo autofocus will only focus on subjects within the frame and will stop focusing if the subject leaves the frame. This can be particularly useful for talking headshots. For now, I'll leave it on the default settings, with servo enabled and detection priority. The next few settings are the same as those used for photography. I'll set the autofocus area to whole area, subject detection to auto, and leave the rest as they are. On tab 2, there are some unique settings for video. The first, movie servo autofocus speed, determines how quickly the camera transitions focus from one area or subject to another. By setting a slow autofocus speed, you can create smooth and gradual focus transitions. You can choose to have this feature activated at all times or only during recording. I will keep everything on the default settings. The next setting, movie servo autofocus tracking sensitivity, allows you to lock on the autofocus on your initial subject or make it more responsive and sensitive to detect new subjects entering the focus area. I will keep this setting as is. Tabs 3, 4, 5 and 6 have the same options as the photo environment, so I will set them up with the same settings, if they haven't been already. Alright, we are now ready to customize the buttons and dials on the R8. Open the menu and go to the orange section with the camera configuration icon. By the way, it doesn't matter if you're in the photo or video environment, as these settings will apply to both. There isn't much to change on the first two tabs, so leave everything as is unless you have a specific need for one of these options. On tab 3 you can customize buttons and dials. Let's start with the dials. Personally, I like the default setup, with the shutter speed on the top dial and aperture on the thumb dial. But what about ISO? Well, unfortunately the R8 only has two dials. But if you have an RF lens connected, you can customize the control ring on the lens to adjust ISO. Now I shoot a lot of video, so it makes more sense for me to assign the control ring to white balance. This allows me to make quick and easy changes without having to go through the menus all the time. I'll assign ISO to one of the buttons instead. By the way, if you want want to learn more about exposure settings like shutter speed, aperture and ISO, I have a dedicated video on that, and I'll put it in the description below. Now let's save these and move on to customizing the buttons. There are two columns here, one for photo mode and one for video mode. To make it easier for your muscle memory, I suggest assigning the same functions to buttons for both photo and video. It's totally up to you though. Here's how I've configured mine. The shutter and movie buttons are fine as they are. The multifunction button, which is located next to the shutter button, can have multiple functions. Press set to configure it. Pressing the info button allows you to set up to 5 pairs of shortcuts for easy access. Now choose the ones you use the most frequently, and once you're happy with the setup, press info to confirm and set to save. Now let's see how it all works. Press the multifunction button to show the shortcuts. Now use the top dial to change settings for the selected shortcut on the top row and use the thumb dial for the bottom row. You can move to the next shortcut pair by pressing the multifunction button again. Now honestly, I only use the multifunction button for ISO. I set the first shortcut to ISO and all others to off. This effectively turns the multifunction button into a dedicated ISO button, allowing me to adjust ISO using the top dial. It's a simple workaround for the R8's limited number of dials for exposure control. Now you'll need to repeat the same process for the video mode. Again, I'll just use my workaround for ISO, but set it up how it works best for you. Now let's configure the other buttons. I use the AF on button to start and stop tracking, the start button to toggle servo on or off, and the button below to magnify the frame. Lastly, since the R8 lacks a joystick, I set the D-pad buttons for direct autofocus selection, so I can easily move around the focus area. The remaining settings are fine, so we're done here. Once you get used to your custom button and dial setup, your muscle memory will kick in, and you'll be able to configure your camera for a specific shot with just a couple button presses. There are a few more tabs in the orange menu, but I typically don't change these settings, just leave as is. Now let's proceed to set up the quick controls. These are a set of on-screen shortcuts that appear when pressing the Q button on the back of the R8. While in the photo environment, press menu and navigate to the red section with the camera icon. Go to tab 8 and customize quick controls. Here we can edit the layout, reset the settings or clear all of the items. Press edit layout. On the first screen you can select up to 11 different settings that will be displayed on the quick controls. Choose the settings that you often adjust. I'll go with autofocus area, subject detection, drive mode, anti-flicker shoot, white balance, cropping and aspect ratio, raw burst, focus bracketing, silent shutter, autofocus manual focus and screen brightness. Now press info to rearrange the order of the settings. When you're done, press menu, save and exit. Now when you press the Q button, the customized quick controls appear on the screen. Use the thumb dial to navigate through the different controls and the top dial to change the selected setting. Or just use the D-pad on the back, it's a lot easier. Alright, now let's switch to the video environment and set up our quick controls there as well. I will choose autofocus area, subject detection, audio level, headphones level, movie recording size, image stabilization mode, white balance, zebra, servo autofocus speed, servo autofocus sensitivity, and screen brightness. Press info again to rearrange the order, save and exit, and we're done. Let's just check if it's working. Alright, with the buttons, dials and quick controls all configured, let's take a look at my menu. Navigate to the end of the menu to the green section with the star icon. Here you can register menu items that you frequently adjust, making them easily accessible without having to look through everything. Let's add a My Menu tab and press OK to confirm. Press again to configure it. In this section you can add, sort and delete items, as well as rename or delete the tab altogether. I recommend creating multiple tabs for different purposes. Let's begin renaming this one to Photo. On the next tab you'll find a couple of options. Let's add another tab and rename it to Video. Now add one more and rename it to Common. Repeat this one more time and rename the last tab to Other. Now navigate to the last tab. Here you can customize the behavior of the menu button. Personally, I like to set it to display from the My Menu tab. This way, when you press the menu button, the My Menu tab will appear first on the screen, giving you immediate access to your most frequently used menu items. Really handy. Now let's customize the different tabs. Press Configure and then select items to register. You can add up to 6 settings per tab. Now just add the ones you want to add to My Menu. Now it may take some time, since there are many options to choose from. But once it's set up, it will make everything a lot easier. Here's what I've set up for my R8. In the Photo tab, I have shortcuts for image quality, shutter mode, interval timer, bulb timer, multiple exposure, and highlight alert. In the Video tab, I have Canon log settings, movie cropping, movie servo autofocus, time-lapse, high frame rate, and false colors. In the Common tab, I have image stabilization mode, manual focus peaking, stickiness, high frequency anti-flicker, customize quick controls, and custom modes. Finally, in the Other tab, I have airplane mode, USB connection, firmware, format card, sensor cleaning, and reset camera. Okay, so everything is pretty well configured now. We've come a really long way. However, there's still one more thing we can do to take it to the next level. Custom shooting modes. You can register all of the camera's current settings, menus, dials and buttons and assign them to a custom mode. The benefit is that you can configure your camera specifically for a certain type of shoot and save that configuration for easy access. The R8 offers 2 custom modes, C1 and C2 on the mode dial. These modes work independently in both photo and video environments, meaning you have 2 custom modes for photo and an additional 2 custom modes for video. Now for this to make sense, you'll need to configure the custom modes for the type of shoots that you do most often. I'm a hybrid shooter, meaning I do both photo and video work, although lately I focus more on video. I'll show you how I set up for my use case. Let's start with photography. First, I'll set up a custom shooting mode for static subjects, such as landscapes or products. Let's make sure we're in the photo environment and in manual mode. By the way, you can register any of the modes to a custom mode, not just the manual. First, exposure. Now note that these settings are intended as a starting point only and will need to be adjusted based on the environment and the desired shot. I will set the shutter speed to around 1/80. I usually leave aperture at the lens's widest, so in this case f4. ISO can remain on auto. Now press Q for quick controls. Single point autofocus will be fine for this use case, and I will turn off subject detection since I will be focusing on landscapes or products. For drive mode, high-speed continuous will work fine, and let's keep auto white balance as well. I will leave focus bracketing off, but it's convenient to have it available here for this type of shot. The other quick controls are fine. Now using our custom star button, I will set the autofocus operation to one shot, as this works best for static subjects in my opinion. Next, press the menu button, which will take us directly into our customized My Menu. In the Photo tab, all of the options are already good for this type of shot. Now save all of these settings to custom shooting mode C1. Make sure auto update is disabled though, otherwise the camera will override the custom shooting mode whenever you change anything. Register the settings, C1, and OK. Now let's immediately set up a second custom mode, maybe one for capturing moving subjects, such as pets or portraits. For this type of shot, I'll increase the shutter speed to something like 1/400. Aperture I can leave at the widest and ISO on auto. Again, this is just something to set as a starting point. Now quick controls. This time I'll use whole area autofocus and rely on the camera's auto subject recognition. I'll set the drive mode to high speed continuous plus. The other controls are fine. I'll also press the star button to enable servo autofocus, so we have continuous focus on our subject. Now in the menu, I'll change the shutter mode to electronic. This will work better for fast-paced action shots. If you're setting this up for portraits though, the first curtain will be fast enough. Other settings are okay, so let's register settings to custom shooting mode C2. OK to confirm. Let's try this out now. When I turn the mode dial to C1, all of our settings for static subjects will be ready for my next awesome landscape shot. And when I turn the mode dial to C2, I've got everything configured for fast-moving subjects. Awesome, right? Now let's also set up custom shooting modes for video. The process is exactly the same. Toggle the switch on the top left to the video environment and go back into manual mode. First, I'll set up a custom mode for my talking head, interviews and general walk-around shots. In the quick controls, I'll set the quality and frame rate to 4K 25p and the autofocus area to whole area. Subject detection can be auto, it works just fine. I'll set the white balance to a color temperature of 5600 Kelvin since I mostly shoot in the studio or daylight for this use case. Digital IS can stay off, but it's here if needed. The same goes for zebras. The servo speed is fine on the default setting, but I'll decrease the responsiveness to have a stronger lock on my subject. The rest of the settings are good as they are. Next, let's set the exposure. Since my frame rate is 25 frames per second, I'll set the shutter speed to 1/50. Aperture at the widest and ISO auto. Now into the menu to tap 2 for the video settings. I'll turn on Canon Lock, View Assist and use Cinema Gamut. I don't need a movie crop and the remaining settings look fine. So let's register these settings to custom shooting mode C1 for video, which will now show a video icon. Let's immediately set up a second custom mode, this time for slow motion B-roll. Press Q for the quick controls. Quality to 4K 50, 4K 60 if you're in Team NTSC. I'll set the autofocus area to single point. I tend to use that much more often for B-roll. Subject detection off, I can always turn it on if I have a specific subject in the frame. I'll set white balance to daylight, digital IS and zebras off. And I will also reduce servo autofocus speed so I have a bit more of a cinematic focus transition. And sensitivity back into the middle. The rest looks good. Now exposure. We're at 50 frames per second, so shutter speed should go to 1/100. Aperture and ISO are okay. Now back into the menu, everything is set here already. So register the settings to custom shooting mode C2 for video. Let's try it out. Turning the mode dial to C1, I'm all set for my talking head. And flicking over to C2, my camera is now configured for those smooth slow motion B-roll shots. Yes, you did it. It took quite a bit of effort, but you've now fully configured your Canon R8 and you're ready to take your photo and video game to the next level. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. Here's a couple more of my videos to watch next. Please give me a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.